And then we'll do as is our custom. We will turn to the Parsha in a nutshell, where we can get the summary, I guess, attempt to get the summary of the Parsha. So here we go. A bow in a nutshell. So bow means come. The last 3 of the 10 plagues are visited on Egypt. A swarm of locusts devours all the crops and greenery. A thick, palpable darkness envelops the land, and all the firstborn of Egypt are killed at the stroke of midnight, the 15th of the month of Nisan. So that's the 10th plague. It's a little out of order here because the paragraphs that follow happen before the 10th plague, happen after the 9th plague. So here we go. God commands the first mitzvah to be given to the people of Israel, which is to establish a calendar based on the monthly rebirth of the moon. The Israelites are also instructed to bring a Passover offering to God, a lamb or kid goat to be slaughtered, and its blood sprinkled on the doorposts and lintel of every Israelite home, so that God should pass over these homes when he comes to kill the Egyptian firstborn. The roasted meat of the offering is to be eaten that night together with matzah, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. So we read about the first Passover Seder. We think about a Passover Seder as a meal that would commemorate the Exodus, but in reality, while that is true, the Passover Seder does commemorate the Exodus. The first Passover Seder was not a commemorating something that happened in the past, but it was preparation for something about to happen in the future, because it was the Passover celebration that protected the Jews, the Jewish homes, from the plague of the firstborn, and eventually led to the redemption, as we will read. The death of the firstborn finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance, and he literally drives the children of Israel from his land. So hastily do they depart that there is no time for their dough to rise, and the only provisions they take along are unleavened. Before they go, they ask their Egyptian neighbors for gold, silver, and garments, fulfilling the promise made to Abraham that his descendants will leave Egypt with great wealth. The children of Israel are commanded to consecrate all firstborn and to observe the anniversary of the Exodus each year by removing all leaven from their possessions for 7 days, eating matzah and telling the story of their redemption to their children. They are also commanded to wear tefillin on the arm and head as a reminder of the Exodus and their resultant commitment to God. So it's actually interesting that the tefillin have 4 portions. They have 4 compartments. Well, the head tefillin has 4 compartments. The hand tefillin has only 1 compartment, but it has 4 portions. What are the 4 portions? So 2 of them are from Deuteronomy, which is the Shema, which is the Jewish proclamation of the unity of Hashem. And that's also in the mezuzah. The first Shema and the second paragraph of the Shema, which is from a different portion, V'hayim Shemaya, will be if you heed my commandments. So that is the theme of the unity of God, the theme of keeping the commandments, the theme of loving God. It's there, these sort of general commandments. That's the 2 paragraphs of the Torah that are both in the mezuzah and in the tefillin. But the tefillin have another 2 paragraphs, and they are the final 2 paragraphs of this week's parsha. They are the paragraphs that discuss the mitzvah to consecrate the firstborn, animal or person, and that commemorates the Exodus. And also the mitzvah of, you'll do this when you come to Israel, your child will ask you, V'yigad levincha, tell it to your child. So the mitzvah commemorating the Exodus are so important that it actually goes in the tefillin, so we obviously think about it every day. Okay, so this is the general story of the parsha. Now we could open up and start looking at it more specifically. As always, if anybody has any comments or questions or something specific you want to talk about, please do not hesitate to share. Otherwise, the journey begins. Okay, so just by way of an introduction, even before we get into the parsha, so you have you have the first part of the parsha discusses the plagues, the plague number 8 and 9, and it follows the pattern of the previous parsha where Moshe is warning Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, don't come back, and he doesn't come back, and they're negotiating, and the negotiation fails. So you have that's the beginning of the parsha. And then in the middle, sort of breaking the order, the order of the 10 commandments, the 10 plagues, you have chapter 12. Chapter 12 is full of commandments. The commandment to consecrate the new moon, in other words, to make a new calendar, the commandment to celebrate the Passover offering. And one way of looking at this is that what God is signaling to the Jewish people is that freedom ultimately does not come from outside the person. It cannot only come from God. God cannot bring the 10 plagues and crush the Egypt, and that would make the Jewish people free. It doesn't work that way, because you could take a person out of prison, but that doesn't mean he's free. That just means there's no oppressor. So he, the jailer forgot to lock the jail. So technically he's out of prison, but in reality, he's not free. In other words, freedom cannot come from somebody outside of you. Freedom has to come from within. And therefore, before the 10th plague could be brought upon the Egyptians, before the physical freedom could come about, the Jewish people have to be active. They have to be active, and we'll see how they were active, but they have to be active, and they have to do things that would celebrate and signal their freedom. And that is critical. So in other words, freedom is not what is God going to do for the people? How is God going to get us out of Egypt? God does his part. God is going to strike the Egyptians. That's something we couldn't do at that point. We were too weak to battle the Egyptians. So God will get rid of the Egyptians. God will battle the Egyptians. But that's not going to bring freedom. Freedom is, what are we going to do? How are we going to take advantage of the opportunity? And therefore, even before Pharaoh says, you can go, leave Egypt, even before Pharaoh says you leave Egypt, we have a list of things that we have to do. Because freedom has to be seized by the person. It cannot be granted. And that's why there's a list of mitzvot. And part of those mitzvot, if you think about it, it's not just technical. It's not just, take a sheep and put it keep it in your house for 4 days, and then slaughter it, and then roast it, and then eat it. That just sounds technical. God is telling us what to eat for supper that night. But if you think about it, the act of taking the sheep was an act of rebellion, because the sheep was one of the gods of Egypt. And to slaughter the god of Egypt would be heresy. And that's why there's if you look back in the book of Genesis, the Torah says that Egypt was an abomination in Egypt for people who raise cattle, because the cattle was their god, or symboled their god. And that's why Joseph tells the Pharaoh, make sure my brothers don't live in downtown Cairo, or downtown, whatever the capital city was at the time, because they are shepherds, and the Egyptians would not be able to tolerate it. So now, a little more than 200 years later, when the Jewish people are taking the sheep, which is the deity of Egypt, and they're slaughtering it, and they're not slaughtering it in their basement where nobody knows. They're actually going to slaughter it. They're going to put the blood on the outside of the doors. Okay? So in other words, they're advertising what they're about to do. And also, they don't cook the meat in the pot. They're actually going to roast it. Roast it means no pot, not like today. Today you put it in the oven. Roast means on the fire, no pot, just directly on the fire. That's the definition of roast in Hebrew. So in other words, why they have to roast it. So there are all kinds of interpretations why the commandment was to specifically roast the Pasticle lamb. But one interpretation is the purpose is to advertise, because the roast gives out a smell. If you're barbecuing, the whole block can hear it, can smell it. And all Egypt knows that you're taking their deity and you're slaughtering it, and you're advertising it by putting the blood on the doorposts, and you're roasting it so everybody can smell. And what is it? It's an act of defiance. And that's on the most basic level. God cannot take you out of Egypt, but God can remove the oppressor, but it's your job to act in a free manner, to take your destiny into your own hands. Once God removes the oppression, even before God removes the oppression, the freedom has to come internally. And that is one, and that's why the Torah gives so much description about what we're supposed to do before the Exodus, because that's integral to the story of the freedom. Now so there's so much more to add on that, but I just wanted to put it out right there. Why did I want to put it out there? Because that ties into a beautiful commentary in the beginning of the Parsha. So let's share the beginning of the Parsha, and we'll think about it, but we'll think about it in the context of being passive or active to the circumstances that surround us. So here we go. So this is the beginning of the Parsha, Exodus chapter 10, verse 1. If you have a stone book and a stone chumash and you want to look inside, if you want to, if you don't, it would be on the stone art scroll. It would be on page 341. And here we go. The Lord said to Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order that I may place these signs of mine in his midst." In other words, God is reiterating this point to Moshe, that God is sending Moshe again to Pharaoh to demand that he release the Jewish people. We know that Pharaoh will not, because God hardened his heart. That's another whole discussion. But why does God harden his heart? In order that God could put the signs in his midst. In other words, that God could perform the 10 plagues. Why does God want to perform the 10 plagues? Well, he's got all kinds of magic tricks. And he needs an opportunity to express it. It's a little deeper than that. It's an educational opportunity. God wants to show the people, both the Egyptians and the Jews, that God is above nature. And therefore, God could do things that are out of the ordinary. So that's verse 1. Now we go to verse 2. Verse 2 is very interesting. "And in order that you tell in the ears of your son and your son's son, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and that you tell of my signs that I placed in them, and you will know that I am the Lord." So here, right in the second verse of the Parsha, we have a theme that's going to be repeated many times in the Torah, but also in the end of this week's Parsha at great length. And that is that the obligation to tell the story to your children, child, grandchild, etc. And that happens later in the Parsha as well. And it happens 4 times throughout the Torah. The Torah says that there's a commandment to tell the story to your children, which is fascinating that Rabbi Sachs talks about this, that other cultures, when they wanted to commemorate an event, they build a structure, they build a pyramid, they build a statue. And the Jewish people don't have structures. We don't build a building to commemorate the Exodus. What is our structure? Our structure is education. The way we commemorate an event is not by building something of stone or of earth, but it's conveying it to our children. And perhaps that's why we're still here. But in any case, that's verse number 2. Okay, what happens in verse number 2? So there is, in order that you tell. Now, there's all kinds of words in Hebrew for telling. There's saying, there's telling. Here, lissaper, uleman tissaper. Lissaper is to tell a story. That's what the word means, story. Now, later on in the verse, you say, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians. Mockery is one interpretation. Hitalalti as mockery. But there's another interpretation. The other interpretation is that alilah could be a plot. In other words, what God is telling you, I'm doing the 10 Commandments. Why so? So that you should tell the story to your children. And not just the story, but tell the plot to your children. So what does this mean? What is this signal? What is this telling us? So the commentaries explain, especially the Kabbalists love this idea, that part of slavery is where a person is controlled by their circumstances, and therefore they don't have anything to say. They don't speak. Because speak means, if I talk, means I'm imparting meaning into the circumstance. If I could tell a story, then I could control, psychologically, I can control my events. Something bad happens to me. Well, if I'm just accepting it, then I'm enslaved to it. But if I tell myself a story, I say, look, this is a challenge, and this is going to help me grow. And this is only one twist of the plot. By definition, a plot is multiple events, one leading to the next. So if you're the storyteller, then you're taking control of your environment, even if the objective reality doesn't change, but subjectively, you are now in control. And the Kabbalists talk about this, and they say, if you look back in the Torah, and you look back to the slavery, And when the slavery was harshest, what does it say? I'll read you the verse. It's a fascinating verse. Terrible verse, really, but I'll read it anyway. So it's, let's see if we can find it. Genesis chapter 2. Not Genesis. What am I saying? Genesis. I got my books wrong. Exodus chapter 2. Okay, so this is Genesis, Exodus chapter 2, which describes the harshness of the slavery. And finally, at the end, here we go. Now it came to pass in those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed from the labor, and they cried out, and their cry ascended to God from the labor. God heard their cry, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. What a beautiful verse. It discusses how the people cried out to God and how God saw what happened. And finally, God says, okay, I have the covenant with the patriarchs. I have to know, I have to get involved, I have to step in, and I have to get the people out of their slavery. So this looks like a very beautiful story. But the Kabbalists say verse 23 is a tragedy. And that's actually why God steps in, because we got to the lowest point. We fell so low, God now has to intervene. Why is 23 a tragedy? Because what does it say? It says the Jewish people sighed. What does a sigh mean? Sigh means they can't articulate, they can't speak. Even when it says they cried out to God, ze'akah is a cry, but it's not a cry that is spoken. It's just a cry, undefined. And that is the slavery. Now, contrast that. That is the idea of being a slave psychologically, internally. Contrast that with this week's parsha. What do you have in this week's parsha? God says, now I'm going to bring the 10 plagues, which is going to start the freedom. And what happens at the freedom? What happens? Verse 2. And in order that you tell in the ears of your son, you're telling a story. If you're telling a story, you're in control. Because even if the circumstances are terrible, you understand it's part of a story. It's part of an alila, a plot. And a plot, yes, every good plot must have something negative. They must have a challenge, must have a tension. Otherwise, you're not going to sell any books, right? Any author knows. You must have the tension. The tension must be resolved. But this tension cannot be resolved unless you create the tension. So once you're telling the story, if I'm telling a story, okay, it's my story. I could already define and I could understand. And I am taking control of the circumstances. And that is something that happens as a preparation for the freedom. So all I'm saying is that this is consistent with the bigger point. That is, God can make us free. We have to make ourselves free. We have to tell the story. We have to take control. And that's part of the theme of Exodus chapter 12, this week's parsha, of all the preparations for the Exodus, without which there could be no Exodus. Because God could take us out of Egypt, but that will make us free. For us to be free, we have to seize and take control of our circumstances. We have to understand that we're not being we're not the victim of the environment, but we give meaning and we understand. And we understand that this is just a twist in the plot. But at the end of the day, we're riding the wave. And this is all here for us to use it in a positive way. So that's all by way of introduction to understand the spiritual significance of slavery and the spiritual significance of storytelling. And of course, like everything else, it applies in our life as well. I wake up in the morning, something happened. Doesn't matter what. I got stuck in traffic. I got a flat tire. It doesn't matter what happened. Now it depends. What is my response? Would my response be, I sigh? Sigh means I'm suffering, but I don't have a story to tell. If I don't have a story to tell, I'm a slave of my circumstances. If I could tell a story, if I understand, oh, this happened. Why did it happen? Why am I here? Why did this negative thing happen to me? What is it supposed to lead me? What's the next chapter? How am I going to transition from chapter A to chapter B? Oh, if you're telling the story, you're in control. And if you're telling the story, you're not enslaved, you are free. So that's a very important and general idea. And that's why Jews love to tell stories. And Hasidim, oh my God, they love to tell stories, because when you tell the story, you could have nothing. Your physical reality could be in terrible shape. You could be even enslaved physically. But if you're the storyteller, your spirit is free. So that's all by way of introduction. And hopefully this is going to be enjoyable and helpful. Okay, now we could start learning. Once we decide that we're telling the story, now we can start learning. Okay. Okay, let's look a little bit about the negotiation between Pharaoh. I said this in the past, but it's a very important point. And it's going to appear a few places throughout the Parsha. Let's look at the negotiation between Pharaoh and the Jewish people. The problem with the negotiation between Pharaoh and Moshe is not so much that they can't agree, right? Sometimes you have two people that can't agree. Usually sometimes when you have a negotiation, you have people coming from two different perspectives and two different cultures. So they're saying the same thing. They're saying the same words, but those words mean different things to different people from different cultures. And many times, that's when negotiation breaks down. And that's exactly what happens in this parsha. Moshe says, you got to let the people go. They have to serve God in the desert. Pharaoh says, at this point, after 7 plagues, Pharaoh is already broken to somewhat. And Pharaoh is willing to negotiate the terms of going to serve the God in the desert for 3 days, which leads to a greater question, which I don't know if we'll go into today. If not today, the next week, then why the deception? Moshe never told Pharaoh, let us go, we want to leave Egypt, and we don't want to come back. He never said that. He always says, let my people go and serve me in the desert. And later he says 3 days in the desert. He doesn't say what's going to happen after the 3 days, right? Nowhere does it say you have to tell Pharaoh all the information, but he certainly is not giving him his true intention. But that's another discussion. So from Pharaoh's perspective, what's happening here, they're negotiating a 3-day break of labor, 3-day strike, where the slaves will stop working, put the economy on halt, and they're going to go serve God in the desert. Now we can negotiate the terms. And as you will see, there's a colossal breakdown in this conversation. And it doesn't really work. And let's see what happens. And it's more important to us to understand why, what this breakdown of communication represents, because it teaches us what Moshe is telling us, what Moshe tells us about the way we serve God. So here we go. So Moshe comes in and gives them the threat. He says the locust will come. And if you're in the Middle East, locust is a terrible problem, even in the modern world. Certainly it's scary. Okay, so the servants of Pharaoh say, this is crazy. This is national suicide. You can't just ignore these people. They have a track record. They have 7 plagues that have actually, they brought 7 plagues upon us. They're threatening an 8th one, the devastating one. So we have to listen to them. So look at verse 7. Here, all of a sudden, Pharaoh's ministers are telling him, you gotta pay attention. Pharaoh's servant said to him, how long will this one be a stumbling block to us? Let the people go and they will worship their God. Don't you yet know that Egypt is lost? In other words, Egypt will be destroyed if you continue on this path? Okay, fine. So we're going to bring them back for negotiation. Thereupon, Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. And he said to them, go worship the Lord your God. Who are going? So he says, okay, you want to worship God? Go worship God. Give me a list of the people who are going. Moses said, with our youth and with our elders we will go. With our sons and with our daughters, with our flocks and with our cattle we will go. For it is a festival for the Lord to us. Moshe says, who's going? Everybody's going. Young, old, sons, daughters, sheep, cattle. We're going to have a festival. So the Pharaoh said to him, so may the Lord be with you, just as I will let you and your young children out. See that evil is before your faces. He says, one second, if I let you out with your children, then it's evil. You have evil intention. You're obviously just trying to go and not come back. Verse 11, not so. Let the men go and worship the Lord, for that is what you request. And he chased them out from before Pharaoh. So let's think about this for a second. What happens is Pharaoh agrees, okay, we have to let the people go serve God in the desert because this plague is going to be too devastating. So he calls Moshe back, says, give me the list of the people who are going. Moshe says, who's going? Everybody's going, also the children, sons, daughters, and as well as the cattle. Why? Because we have a festival to God. Pharaoh says, impossible. That's not what you want. Let the men go. And the key is, for that is what you request. What does that mean? For that is what you request in verse 11. Right? He says, let the men go now and worship the Lord, for that is what you request. What does that mean? So you're telling Moshe what he wants. He's telling you what he wants. He wants to go. He wants everyone to go. That's his request. So this is a beautiful interpretation from the Kli Yakar, 16th century sage and Kabbalist, who's the chief rabbi of Krakow. He's also the Pam Koretsky's great-grandfather. But in any case, an unbelievable commentator. And he says as follows, and he says that, what is Pharaoh saying? For that is what you request. Pharaoh is telling Moshe, you want to serve God? Okay, how is God served? In every society at the time, who serves God? The men. Why the men? The men are the people who are educated, or at least some of the men are educated. They understand what it means to serve God. They understand the rituals. They know how to do it. So they serve God on behalf of everybody else. Now, Moshe said, if you look at Moshe's words, Moshe says we have to take everybody, even the young children. Why? Because they're going to serve God. What, the young children are going to go to shul and pray? They don't know how to pray. They don't know how to slaughter. They don't know how to do anything. So Moshe says, for a festival of the Lord, for it is a festival of the Lord to us. Moshe says to Pharaoh, you don't understand how Jews celebrate. How do Jews worship God? We don't worship God, only the smart people, only the educated people worship God. No, for us, we worship God through the festival. When you have everybody together with joy, that is when the family comes together. That is how we worship God. And therefore we need everybody, and therefore we need the cattle. Pharaoh says, what? That's not what God wants. That's what you want. God wants a festival. God wants worship. And Moshe says, you misunderstand what our worship is, how we serve God. And the way we serve God is we serve God with everybody, because we serve God is not by sort of having a spiritual relationship with God that is only specific for the people who understand spirituality, and maybe men, and maybe only some men, maybe only the educated men. Pharaoh says, give me the list. Who's going to go? He assumes it's 100 people, 1,000 people. And Moshe is saying, no, that's not the way we celebrate. The way we do it with everybody, because the way we serve God is with joy, with happiness, not only, it's not exclusive to a philosophical connection with God. And that's why Moshe says, we are out. This is not the way we serve God. But this is telling about how we serve God. How we serve God is with the family together and as a celebration. This is also important later in the Parsha. Why is this important later in the Parsha? So if you look later in the Parsha, you'll see that there's a whole ritual about eating the Pasticle sacrifice. So with your permission, I'm going to skip a little. We'll work our way backward. But for right now, just to tie this in, I'm going to skip a little farther down, and I'm going to go to the chapter 12, and we talk about the commandments to prepare the Pasticle sacrifice. Okay, so let's share the screen, and we'll see how this all ties in. So in case you have a book, it would be chapter 12. It would be on page, okay, the bottom of page, okay, that's page 351, we would say. So that would be Exodus chapter 12, verse 3. Okay. Speak to the entire as a community of Israel, saying, on the 10th of the month. I don't know. Maybe he's upstairs. I don't know. On the 10th of the month, let each one take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, right? You're going to have 2 people in the household. How are you going to eat a full lamb? Then he and his neighbor who was nearest to his house shall take one according to the number of the people. Each one according to one's ability to eat, shall you be counted for the lamb. In other words, if your family can't eat a lamb alone, you join with another family, right? Then he and his neighbor who was nearest to his house. Okay, you shall have a perfect male lamb in its first year. You may take it either from the sheep or from the goats. So they take this on the 10th day. But remember, the point is to rebel. The point is to make the statement, at least according to one of the commentators. So when we want to experience an act of defiance. So we don't just take the lamb and slaughter it at the last minute. We take it 4 days early, right? Because if you look at verse 3, it says on the 10th day of this month, let each one take a lamb. And then verse 6, and you shall keep it for inspection until the 14th day of the month. 4 days it's just sitting there tied within your house. And the entire congregation of the community of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. And this is verse 7 is very, very strange. It's very almost seems paganistic. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel, on the houses in which they will eat it. And on this night they shall eat the flesh, roasted over fire, and unleavened cakes. With bitter herbs they shall eat it. You shall not eat it rare or boiled in water, except roasted over the fire its head with its legs and its innards. We're going to skip a little bit. We're going to skip to verse 12 and 13. I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night, and I will smite every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And upon all the gods of Egypt I will wreak judgment. I am the Lord. In other words, God says he's going to kill all the firstborn. Now we get back to the blood. And the blood will be for you as a sign upon the houses where you will be. And I will see the blood and skip over you. And there will be no plague to destroy you when I smite the people of the land of Egypt. In other words, you have to have a blood on the door so that will protect us from God, because God may not notice who's Jew and who's Egyptian. Especially at night. It's at midnight. How does God know? It's not like he had GPS of which home was where. So God needs the blood to remind him so he could point out what's the Jewish home. Okay, that's obviously ridiculous. So why do we need the blood to protect us? So ultimately, there's multiple interpretations, but the basic interpretation I already said earlier, the fact that they're putting the blood on the doorpost, which is an act of defiance of Egypt, makes them worthy of the Exodus, of being saved. In fact, the commentaries explain that the Jewish people themselves, most of them, except for the tribe of Levi, were invested in idol worship. Were invested in idol worship in Egypt, and taking the sheep for 4 days and slaughtering the sheep represents slaughtering the idol, but really represents slaughtering the idol worship. So that's an act of separating themselves from idol worship, which then makes them worthy of the redemption. Okay, fine. Now let's get a little bit more mystical. If you read those verses, it rings very familiar to the verses in the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus discusses the laws of the sacrifices. And there it says that every sacrifice, that all sacrifices have different details. Some sacrifices are eaten by the priest. Some sacrifices are eaten by the person who brings the animal. There's all kinds of laws, very, very detailed. But all sacrifices have one thing in common. There's always blood taken and placed on the altar. So there's always blood involved, always putting the blood on the altar. And then there's also an area in which the offering could be eaten. There's one class of offerings that could be eaten only in the temple. That's called Holy of Holies, Kache Kadashim. And then you have another class of offerings that can be eaten anywhere in the city of Jerusalem. That's called Kadashim Kalim, the light holies. You have the Holy of Holies and the lighter holies. So lighter holies, Thanksgiving offering, you can eat anywhere in Jerusalem. You got more space, you could take it to your hotel, and you could eat it anywhere in Jerusalem. So every sacrifice has two properties. The blood must be placed on the altar, and the sacrifice must be eaten within a certain boundary, within a certain holy boundary. Okay. What happens in Egypt? What happens and that's true for once the Exodus happens, the Pasticle sacrifice cannot be brought anywhere in your house. It has to be brought in Jerusalem. The blood has to hit the altar, and it has to be eaten within the city of Jerusalem. Okay. But what happens at the birth of our nation? Egypt is the birth of our nation. What happens at the birth of our nation? At the birth of our nation, the first time we celebrate as a nation was the night of Passover. So something there, whatever happens there, is really telling about the true significance of us as a people. What is our real purpose as a people? What's our national mission statement? And here the Kabbalists say something very interesting. They say that Egypt, there's also these two properties. The blood has to reach the altar, which is one of the holiest parts of the temple, and you have to eat the sacrifice within a holy space, within the limitations, within the boundaries of a holy space. But what's the novelty here? Here, the big idea here is, what is the holy space? What is the altar? What is the altar? Every person's home. You put the blood in the temple. Once we come to Israel, we have to travel hundreds of miles to come to the temple to find the holy space. That's not. But essentially, the mission statement of Judaism is that your home is your temple. Therefore, you can put the blood that later will be put only in the temple in Jerusalem. You put it on your doors because your doors are holy. Your boundaries, the entrance to your home, once you come into your home, that's a holy environment. And the Pasticle sacrifice has to be eaten within your home. I don't know if you read the verse, I don't remember, but the verse says you cannot take the Pasticle sacrifice out of that home. Why? Because the home is a holy space. So now what you're telling me is similar to what Moses tells Pharaoh. It's consistent, not the same idea, but consistent. That in Judaism, we don't have a class of people that serve God. We don't have a specific space that is designated to serve God. What we have is the ultimate goal is that every person serve God in their capacity, even young children, because they're part of the festival. They're part of the festival, they're part of the service of God, because service of God is life itself. And then, where is the holy space? So yeah, you go to shul because there it's a time for you can meditate and separate. But ultimately, the purpose of Judaism is to go back home, figuratively put the blood on the doors, symbolize that this is a holy space, this is an altar, this is a space designated to serve God. And the holy items could have to be eaten within a holy boundary. But what is that holy boundary? Anywhere in my home. So that's a totally different model than what the conventional interpretation of religion is, because every religion has a holy space. But what happens if here the Torah signals to us our holy space is our home? Yeah, you also have to go to shul because you have to understand there's running and returning. And in order to be able to bring the holiness into your home, you also have to run, which means go above the physical, connect to the spiritual, but you can't stay there. The point is to bring the holiness back to your home. So the first Passover Seder we had is really the symbol of everything that we were supposed to do, that we're going to do later as a people. So that's point number 2 for today. Just to summarize, point number 1 is that if you want to be free, you have to tell stories. And you have to say the plot. You have to understand there's a plot. In other words, when something happens to you, you don't just sigh. You don't just say, "Oy, something is happening to me." If something happens to you, put it in the context of a story. What's the story? What's the challenge? How is this turn in the plot going to lead me to something better? So that's point number 1. And point number 2 is the purpose of Judaism would be that the entire space of your home, every part of your life is part of the festival to God. So ultimately, there's no dichotomy between the holy and the mundane. There is holy, there is mundane, but ultimately we serve God as a festival. We serve God in every area of our life, and therefore the house itself becomes like the temple in the sense that the holy flesh of the Pasticle sacrifice has to be eaten in the holy environment, but the holy environment is not Jerusalem, but it's anywhere within the boundaries of my home. So that is the first 2 points. And now, if anybody wants any comments, jokes, questions, otherwise we continue on our journey. Now, a big theme here. It's a big theme because it's the first mitzvah. It's also a big theme because the Kabbalists love talking about this. This is sort of one of their favorite verses. So a big theme is the beginning of Exodus chapter 12. And a big theme is the first commandment, which the Jewish people were commanded to engage in. And in fact, this commandment is so important that the Torah actually says, the first Rashi says, we take it for granted that the Torah should start in Genesis because that's the beginning of the story. Where else would you start a story other than the beginning? But if you think about it, what Rashi says in that very first Rashi is he says that the Torah really should not have begun with the story of Exodus. The Torah should not have begun with the story of creation. It's the first Rashi. Story of creation is nice information, but it's not critical. What the Torah should have started, according to the very first Rashi says Torah should have began with Exodus chapter 12. The Torah should have began with the first mitzvah that the Jewish people were commanded to do, which is to create the calendar in Egypt. So it's not only the first mitzvah in the Torah, in other words, the first mitzvah given to the collective Jewish people, but it's so important that Rashi says this should have been the beginning of all of the Torah. Okay, you have a reason why not, but this is very important. And the question becomes, why is the calendar so important if the calendar seems to be very technical? What is calendar? Calendar is you just have to mark the passage of time. So different people have different calendars. It doesn't really matter. You know, the clock marches on, the days pass, the time passes regardless of how we mark it. So marking the time is just completely arbitrary, and it doesn't really have a real impact on the universe. That's the presumption. So yes, you need a calendar, and yes, it's important so people can figure out what, when to go out to Starbucks and meet, figure out when they can meet each other and do things at the same time. But why is this so important? Why is this the first mitzvah? Why can't we go with the Egyptian calendar for another few days? And once we get to Israel, we'll create the Hebrew calendar. So that is the one of the questions on this matter. But first, we'll just read the verses that introduce this mitzvah. So here we go. Chapter 12, Exodus chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be to you the head of the months. To you it shall be the first of the months of the year." So the first thing we're saying is this month, which happened to be the month of Nisan, the month of the Exodus, this month is going to be the first month of the year. So we have a month, Nisan is the first month. So this is going to lead to another problem, which is very confusing. Jewish people are complicated people. So I think we're probably the only people who have 2 new years. Most people have 1 new year. For us, it's not enough. We have Rosh Hashanah as the new year. And then we have the month of Passover is the new year for the months. You get it? Rosh Hashanah is the new year for the years. And the month of Nisan is the new year for the months. Why do we have the double new year is a good question, but we have that. I doubt any other culture does. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, I don't know, but it's certainly complicated. Why do we need two new years? Now, just to go about the grammar here for a little bit, it says, this month shall be to you the head of the months. What does that mean? It means, the first thing I said, the month of Nisan is the first month, but it means deeper than that. It means that the month begins with the new moon. How do you see that? Because the Hebrew word, this month, there's 2 ways to say month in Hebrew. And the one that's chosen is HaChodesh. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this new month. But Chodesh is month. But what does month mean? What's the etymology? What's the root of the word Chodesh? So if you know in Hebrew, Chodesh is Chadash, new. Okay? What are we saying here? What makes a month is the renewal of the month. All right, so let's be clear. When you talk about the months on the secular calendar, the year has 365 days. What is a month? A month is either 31 days or 32 days, but the month does not track the moon at all, because all you're doing is you're taking 365 dividing by 12, more or less. And therefore, the English and the secular months, the days of the month, do not tell you anything about the rotation of the moon around the earth. Whereas the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, actually tracks the month that follows the month's rebirth. And therefore, every month on day 1 of the month, you will see a sliver of the moon. And day 15, you will see the full moon. And day 29, you'll see no moon, because it takes the moon 29 and a half days to circle the earth. And therefore, that's the Jewish month. And it becomes a little complicated because 29 and a half days. So therefore, in the Jewish calendar, you have some months have 29 days, other months have 30 days, and that smooths it out. So when the verse says, this month shall be the first month, it doesn't mean this month. It means this renewal shall be the first month. This renewal means that when the new moon appears, the new moon of Nisan appears, that's the beginning of the first month. Okay, fine. So it's very important to know that we're still in Egypt. That's what the verse says. The verse says, God spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be for you. So it's very important to understand that we're in Egypt, and yet when we're in Egypt, we are creating a calendar. So again, why are we creating a calendar? So this is probably also connected to the things that we have been speaking about earlier of telling your own story, and that is when you how you define time really underscores the freedom that you're taking for yourself. So if we define time the way the Egyptians define time, then we are enslaved to the Egyptians. But if we say, no, we tell our own story, we define time in our own way, that is an act of freedom, of taking our destiny into our own hands. So that's the physical act of, again, rebellion, of defiance. You say it's day 1. No, I say it's day 3, right? So that's an act of defiance. But spiritually speaking, there's a lot more taking place here. Spiritually speaking, again, what the Torah is telling you is that what people think is only a detail, is only a technical detail, how we tell time. No, it's actually a mitzvah to sanctify the new moon. It's actually a mitzvah to be aware of how when the new moon appears, and to count the months and to count the years. It's a mitzvah. Counting time is a mitzvah. Why is counting time a mitzvah? Why is counting time a mitzvah? Like we're just reacting to the passage of time. We don't affect the passage of time. A mitzvah is to build the sukkah. I'm actually doing something. But a mitzvah just to count the passage of time. Why is that a mitzvah? What's the significance? I'm not really doing anything. So here, mystically, what the Torah is telling us is that we actually do affect the time. Now, we have no control of the passage of time. The passage of time itself is something that happens by itself. We have no control. Why we can't turn the clock backward. So in that sense, we don't control the passage of time. But we do control time in the sense that we give meaning to the time. Depending on what we do with the time, that affects what is this time, what's the nature of this time. So when there's a mitzvah to count time, the mitzvah really is understand that the greatest resource you have, the most precious resource you have is time, because that's the only thing that you have no control over. But you do have control of how your time will be defined, how we will use your time, whether your time will be invested in holiness or imbued with holiness or not. In fact, it's very interesting that the mitzvah to sanctify the new moon, even in English, sanctify, is to bring holiness to the new month. It's to bring holiness to time itself. And again, the theme today is that we're not passive. And we're not just affected by the things that happen to us in our life, but we actually define our reality. And the beginning is we actually define the meaning of time, not the passage of time, but the meaning of time. So that's step number one. Then we go to step number two. Step number two is, so we have to find the calendar, we have to track the passage of time. So we're going to track the passage of time based on the moon and not based on the sun. Now it's a little bit more complicated because ultimately we have a leap year. Ultimately we sync the lunar and solar calendar, but that we'll see if we'll discuss that. We'll see if we should discuss that or not. But even before we get there, the basis of the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. Okay. Is it better to have a lunar calendar or a solar calendar? What's more efficient? What's better? So the lunar calendar is more efficient in some ways. It's just easier to tell the passage of time because the sun looks the same every day and it moves 1 degree every day, but it moves very slightly, much harder to tell and to pay attention to the passage to the position of the sun to mark the passage of days. The moon, however, it's very simple. You look at it every day and you look at it if it's a thin moon or big moon or small moon. In fact, last night I was coming back from North Street going south and I saw the moon. It was the second day on the Hebrew calendar. I've never seen the moon so thin. Never seen anything like that. I was showing my children. I said, I've never seen this. The bottom line is it's very easy to look up and see the position of the moon in the sky. To see how much light you could see of the moon. And in fact, every kid knows this because the Hebrew calendar, in the secular calendar, it doesn't work that way. But in the Hebrew calendar, full moon is day 15. No moon is day 29. New moon is day 1. It's very telling. Anytime you go to shul on Rosh Hashanah, you're not going to see the moon, or you'll see just a sliver. Anytime you go to your Passover Seder, I guarantee you, from now till the end of time, anytime you go to your Passover Seder, there will be a full moon. Okay, so in that sense, a lunar calendar is more efficient. However, if you're trying to get invested in agriculture and you want to know when to plant and when to harvest and the seasons, then you should track a solar calendar because the seasons follow the months that follow the sun, and therefore Egypt, which was the superpower at the time, but certainly the agricultural superpower, they were completely invested in the solar calendar because they had to understand how the seasons went to plant, etc. Now, what is the spiritual message of the sun and what's the spiritual message of the moon? So different cultures look up and they see different things. The sun is consistent. The sun is might. The sun is power. The sun is the source of all energy in the world. And therefore, most ancient cultures, including Egypt, in fact, serve the sun. The moon is much less stable, right? The moon represents something. It's not stable. It's not full. It waxes and it wanes. And many cultures were not interested in the moon as a symbol. The moon was a symbol of maybe weakness, of the feminine, it was not considered as not something that the people in the ancient world would worship. And here, the Jewish people are told that we have to create, the way we understand time is we have to understand time followed by the moon. In other words, take the message of the moon. What's the message of the moon? The message of the moon is rebirth and renewal. And that is freedom. And that's why it's the Parsha, in this week's Parsha, the Parsha of freedom. Because what is slavery? Slavery, the most important slavery, the most devastating slavery is when a person feels that they are defined by the past. So I had a bad day, so my whole day is going to go bad. So I had a bad year, so next year also has to be bad. And this is my personality, I can't change. Ultimately, that's slavery. That's the essential point of slavery. And here God says, before we can talk about freedom of Egypt, you have to understand, you have to take the message of the rebirth of the moon to heart. Literally, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. The renewal, this renewal is to you. In other words, you mark the passage of time based on the renewal of the moon. You have to understand yourself in the context of the renewal of the moon. And what's the message of the renewal of the moon? That it doesn't matter what happened yesterday. Today I can create something new. I could become something new. And that is the foundation of all of Judaism. All of Judaism is the free choice. We're not enslaved to the past. We are free to renew. And renew means I'm not bound by the past. And that's why the mitzvah of creating a calendar, of marking the passage of time based on the new moon is critical to the Torah, critical to the Exodus for many reasons. We said, one, to sanctify the time itself, but it's also the idea that I have to take the message of the rebirth of the moon to heart, that I myself could renew and grow, and I'm not trapped by the past. Now, one last point. Maybe we'll depart a few minutes early today. But one last point. Thinking about looking up at the moon and the sun. And like I said, in the modern world, you don't look up to know what day it is. You look down on your iPhone. But in the ancient world, if you wanted to know anything about the time, you had to look upward. So looking upward was the sun, was people were always constantly looking up to see what time of the day it is, what day of the month it is. So people are always looking up. I remember that there's a section in Maimonides about how you have to calculate, how to figure out how to calculate the new moons. It's about 19 chapters, very hard, and I never really got it. But Maimonides says that it's very simple. He says, I did all the hard math. I'm just giving you the simple formulas. Says Maimonides, any school child could do this in 2-3 days. I guess I have to go back to elementary school to figure out how to do it in 2-3 days. But in any case, there's 19 chapters about the sanctification of the moon and how to calculate, how to know exactly to the millisecond when the new moon will appear. And so we studied every year because we study all Maimonides every year. So I remember when I was younger, so there was a student, I had a friend, and I said, I don't really understand what Maimonides is saying. So he says, what's the big deal? From now, for the next 30 days, every night, go outside and look up. And I was like, wow, strange idea. I never thought of that. Like, well, who would ever think of going out every night for 30 days and looking at the sky? In any case, that's what people did. People walked outside and looked at the sky. And there's a beautiful verse in Isaiah that Isaiah says as follows: lift up your eyes heavenward and see who created these. What is Isaiah saying? Isaiah is saying, if you look at nature, you can actually understand that there's a creator to nature, right? If you go to an art museum and you see a work of art, you understand you're going to learn something about the artist. And the same thing is with nature. You look at nature and you learn something about the source of the artist. And that's true about nature on this planet as well. But looking upward has a different effect on the human being. Looking upward is you see how small we are, and it creates this tremendous sense of wonder. So Isaiah says, look up your eyes to the heavenward and see who created these. And you'll know who created these. There's actually an interpretation that the word Shema Yisrael, Hero Israel, that we say twice a day, Shema, Hero Israel, the word Shema here is an acronym for Se'u Marom Einechem, Shin Mem Ayin, Shema, Se'u Marom Einechem, lift up your eyes heavenward. So the Shema, one meeting is the meditation of the Shema is to listen. Listen to what? Listen and look at the creation. Specifically, look up at the creation and see who created these. That will lead you to the creator. Okay. And now there's a Hasidic interpretation, and the Hasidic interpretation says as follows. Let's look at the word Mitzrayim. Okay, let's start before Mitzrayim. Let's start. So far, what do we have? We have Sumar Menechem, lift up your eyes to heavenward and see who created these. Okay. What is the word? One word for God is Elohim. What does Elohim mean? It's really two words. There's many interpretations, but I'm giving you this interpretation. Ele mi. Elohim, God, but it means the God who creates nature. That's the meaning of the word Elohim. Ele mi. These who. That's what Elohim is. Two words. Ele, these. Me, who? What's the connection? Well, Isaiah just said, look up your eyes heavenward and see who created these. Ask the question, who created these? And the word Elohim is the answer. These, the world, who? Who created it? That's the question. But the question is supposed to lead you to an answer. So in other words, the idea of God, of seeing God in nature, it happens through asking the question. Which question? Who created these? Now let's look at our broader story. We're in Egypt. What does Mitzrayim mean? So it means constraints and limitations. But if you want to look at the word Mitzrayim, break it up into two words. Meitzar, me. Limitation, who? Again, what does it mean, limitation, who? In Egypt, they know everything about all the sciences. Certainly at that time, they were most developed scientific nation on earth. They knew everything about the human sciences at the time. But what they didn't understand Isaiah's question. They let you ask any question. You go to the University of Egypt, they can ask any question you want. The only question you cannot ask is the most important question, which is what? Isaiah's question, who created these? So they know about nature, but the slavery, the intellectual and spiritual slavery of Egypt is that they know about nature, but they don't allow for the asking of the most essential question, which is who created these? In other words, they don't get from the creation doesn't direct their attention to the creator. And that's what Egypt is. Meitzar mi, limiting the who. What's the who? The question, who created all of this? And therefore, the antidote for Egypt is the Shema. What is the Shema? We're looking at the same nature. We're looking at the same work of art. The question is, what does this work of art teach us? When the Egyptian looks at the work of art, looks at nature, he says, okay, how can I manipulate the laws of nature to get me a better crop? That's Egypt. That's a wonderful place to be, but that's a spiritual Egypt because it's not allowing you to ask the question of who. The antidote to the spiritual Egypt is the Shema. Lift up your eyes heavenward and see who created these. Allow the world to tell you about, I'm talking about telling stories, right? It's all about how you interpret the stories. Allow the world to tell you about the creator of the world. And that broadens your understanding of reality, and that allows you to escape the confines of the physical and reach the expanses of the spiritual. So that's the story in short. We said quite a few points today, but I hope at least some of them are interesting and, most importantly, inspiring to renewal, because we have a new month, and the first mitzvah is to understand that we can constantly grow, because the person we were yesterday does not define the person we are today, and we constantly we remake ourselves and renew ourselves to reach ever greater levels and heights. So thank you for joining, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and we should meet